When 30-year-old Abigail Hayes bought the abandoned O'Connor property, the entire farming town of Oakhaven laughed until they choked on their coffee. They called her a delusional amateur, throwing her life savings into a toxic weed patch. Exactly 1 year later, nobody is laughing. They're standing in line, begging for her secrets. The dust hadn't even settled on the gravel driveway before the rumors started flying. Oakhaven was the kind of sprawling, conservative agricultural community where everyone knew your soil pH and your bank balance before you even introduced yourself. It was a town built on endless rows of genetically modified corn, heavy synthetic fertilizers, and multi-million-dollar combines. So, when Abigail Hayes pulled up to the rusted, chained gates of the old O'Connor homestead in a sputtering 1998 Ford Ranger, the local rumor mill went into overdrive. The property was a notorious 40-acre scar on the landscape. Left completely abandoned for 15 years after Old Man O'Connor passed away in a nursing home, the land had been completely reclaimed by nature in the worst possible way. It was a suffocating jungle of invasive kudzu, thorny blackberry brambles thick as barbed wire, and twisted, rotting timber. The main barn had a caved-in roof that looked like a crushed ribcage, and the soil was notoriously rocky and dead, having been stripped of its topsoil during decades of poor plowing in the 80s. To the locals, it was useless dirt, but to Ryan Sullivan, it was a tactical acquisition. Ryan Sullivan was the undisputed king of Oakhaven, a third-generation mega-farmer. He owned over 3,000 acres of pristine, flat farmland that surrounded the O'Connor property on 3 sides. Sullivan was a man who wore custom-tailored denim and drove a spotless, heavy-duty truck that had never seen a day of actual mud. For 3 years, he had been lowballing the bank, waiting for the price of the O'Connor land to drop to pennies on the dollar so he could bulldoze the entire 40 acres. Rip out the trees, and add another massive cornfield to his empire. Then Abigail showed up and paid cash. It was her life savings, combined with a modest inheritance from her grandmother. Abigail wasn't the naive city girl they all assumed she was, though she let them believe it. She held a master's degree in regenerative agriculture and had spent the last 7 years working on cutting-edge experimental farms in the Pacific Northwest, studying soil microbiology and high-yield organic crops. But when she walked into Betty's diner on her second day in town, seeking a warm meal after a freezing night in a sleeping bag on her new, dusty living room floor, she was met with openly mocking stares. "Hear you bought the bramble patch, sweetheart," boomed a voice from the corner booth. It was Sullivan, sitting with 2 of his foremen, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Bank manager Thomas Gable told me the ink dried yesterday. I give you 3 weeks before the mosquitoes carry you off, or you go broke trying to clear that mess." The diner erupted in chuckles. Martha, the waitress, poured Abigail a cup of coffee with a sympathetic, albeit condescending, smile. "It's a tough piece of land, honey. Best to just hire someone to clear-cut it, flip it, and head back to the suburbs." Abigail took a slow sip of her black coffee, locking eyes with Sullivan. "I'm not here to clear-cut anything, Mr. Sullivan. I'm here to farm." Sullivan threw his head back and laughed loudly. "Farm? In that wasteland? What are you going to grow, sweetie? Weeds? And tetanus?" "Something a little more profitable than subsidized corn," Abigail replied evenly, setting her mug down and leaving a $5 bill on the counter. She walked out, her spine straight, leaving a sudden, heavy silence in her wake. That interaction set the stage for the war. Sullivan wasn't just amused, he was insulted. He felt a sense of ownership over Oakhaven, and this outsider's quiet confidence grated on his nerves. He immediately made a few phone calls. Within 48 hours, Abigail found that the local hardware store suddenly had supply chain issues when she tried to order basic hand tools, and the only heavy machinery rental business in a 50-mile radius told her their tractors were fully booked for the next 6 months. Sullivan was trying to starve her out before she even planted a single seed. He expected her to crack under the sheer physical impossibility of clearing 40 acres of dense, hostile vegetation by hand. But Abigail hadn't come to conquer the land. She had come to partner with it. Instead of fighting a losing battle with chainsaws and chemicals to create bare soil, Abigail brought in an army, not of men, but of livestock. With the last few thousands in her budget, she purchased 70 rescue goats, the most ragged, ornery, brush-eating machines she could find at regional auctions, and a dozen heritage breed pigs. She fenced them into strategic half-acre paddocks, using portable electric fencing she had brought with her. The town watched from the county road, baffled. Men in shiny green tractors would idle by, shaking their heads as they watched this young woman in mud-stained overalls, moving fencing in the pouring rain. They thought she was running a petting zoo. They didn't realize she was executing a masterclass in biological land clearing. The goats devoured the invasive kudzu and blackberry vines down to the roots, turning the nuisance vegetation into rich fertilizer. The pigs came in right behind them, using their snouts like biological plows, rooting up the hard-packed earth, breaking up the rocks, and churning the goat manure deep into the soil. Within 2 months, without a single drop of diesel fuel or chemical herbicide, the first 5 acres of the wasteland had been cleared, tilled, and aggressively fertilized by nature. The brambles were gone, replaced by rich, dark earth that was teeming with earthworms. But the real drama was just beginning. As the spring planting season approached, the mockery in Oakhaven shifted to genuine bewilderment. Every other farmer in the county was busy injecting anhydrous ammonia into their fields and loading up their massive planters with patented corn seeds. Abigail, however, wasn't planting corn, nor was she planting soybeans, wheat, or anything the local co-op recognized. Instead, a flatbed truck arrived from 2 states away, dropping off massive pallets of what looked like rotting hardwood logs. Then came boxes of peculiar, microscopic spores. Abigail was inoculating the logs with premium shiitake and lion's mane mushroom spawn, setting them up in the damp, shaded areas of her property that the locals considered dead zones. In the sunny, cleared patches, she constructed massive hugelkultur beds, mounds made of rotting wood, compost, and soil, and began planting rows of crocus sativus, saffron. Saffron is the most expensive spice in the world, often selling for over $5,000 a pound. It required meticulous hand harvesting, but it thrived in exactly the kind of well-drained, slightly rocky soil Abigail had uncovered. Beside the saffron, she planted dense, chaotic-looking rows of heirloom garlic, medicinal herbs like ginseng, and specialty-cut flowers. To the trained eye, it was a highly diversified, ultra-lucrative micro-farm designed to yield maximum profit per square foot. To Sullivan and his cronies, it looked like the chaotic garden of a madwoman. "She's planting dead wood and weeds," Sullivan was heard bragging at the diner, slapping his knee. "I'm telling you, the bank will foreclose by September. I've already told Thomas Gable to have the paperwork ready." But Sullivan wasn't content to just wait. The psychological irritation of seeing Abigail's quiet progress every day on his drive into town was eating at him. He began to apply pressure. It started small. Abigail would wake up to find her temporary electric fences snipped, allowing her pigs to wander dangerously close to the county highway. She lost 3 days of work rounding them up. A week later, she found the pristine spring fed well on her property, her only source of irrigation tampered with. Someone had dumped a 50-pound bag of salt down the casing, ruining the water supply just as a brutal, early summer dry spell hit. Abigail was devastated. She stood over the ruined well, her hands trembling with exhaustion and rage. She knew exactly who had done it. She had seen the tire tracks of a heavy-duty truck near the property line, matching the tread of the trucks Sullivan's farmhands drove, specifically a notoriously aggressive foreman named Brody. But without cameras or proof, the local sheriff, a man who played golf with Sullivan every Sunday, simply shrugged it off as kids pulling a prank. With her plants threatening to wither under the relentless sun, Abigail was pushed to the brink. She needed water, and she needed machinery to dig a new irrigation pond fast, but the town had completely blacklisted her. Desperation led her to the outskirts of Oakhaven, to a junkyard run by a man named Gideon Rowe. Gideon was a brilliant mechanic but a town pariah. He had crossed Sullivan years ago in a land dispute, lost heavily, and had been drinking away his resentment in his scrapyard ever since. Abigail found him under the chassis of a rusted backhoe. "I need that backhoe," she said, her voice raspy from dust and lack of sleep. "And I need someone who knows how to build a gravity-fed swale system. I know you used to engineer irrigation before Sullivan ran you out of the market." Gideon slid out, wiping grease from his graying beard, looking at her with a mix of pity and skepticism. "You're the O'Connor girl, the one growing the rotting logs. You're fighting a losing war, kid. Sullivan owns the air you breathe in this town. He doesn't own my soil," Abigail shot back fiercely. "And if you help me dig this pond, I'll pay you double your standard rate as soon as my first harvest sells. Plus, you get the satisfaction of helping me shove Sullivan's arrogance right back in his face." A slow, dangerous smile crept across Gideon's weathered face. I like your grit, kid. Let's go dig a hole. For the next 4 days, working mostly under the cover of darkness to avoid Brody's watchful eyes, Gideon and Abigail used the sputtering old backhoe to carve deep swales and a large catchment pond into the natural contours of the land. They designed a passive water harvesting system that would capture every drop of rain and slowly sink it into the soil, rendering the sabotaged well irrelevant. The real test came just 2 weeks later. A freak, massive summer storm system stalled over Oakhaven. For 3 days, torrential rain pounded the county. It was a 100-year flood event. The results were catastrophic for conventional farmers. Sullivan's massive fields, stripped bare of all cover crops and aggressively tilled to dust, had nothing to hold the water. The rain turned his fields into raging rivers of mud. Thousands of tons of expensive, chemically treated topsoil, along with his freshly applied synthetic fertilizers, washed straight off his land, flooding the county roads and choking the local streams. His crop losses were in the millions, but as the sun finally broke through the clouds, Gideon drove his rusty truck up Abigail's driveway and hit the brakes, staring in absolute awe. Abigail's farm was an oasis. The deep-rooted perennial herbs, the thick hugelculture mounds, and the newly dug swales had acted like a giant sponge. Instead of washing away, the water had been captured, slowing down and sinking deep into the earth. Her farm hadn't lost a single ounce of topsoil. In fact, the moisture had triggered a massive flush in her mushroom logs. Thousands of pristine, alien-looking gourmet mushrooms were erupting from the wood, shimmering in the morning sun. Her saffron beds were lush and vibrant, practically drinking in the humidity. Sullivan's foreman, Brody, drove past the property later that afternoon, intending to gloat over what he assumed would be Abigail's drowned ruins. Instead, he saw Abigail and Gideon carefully harvesting baskets upon baskets of premium lion's mane mushrooms, laughing. Brody slammed his hand against the steering wheel, his face red with fury. The sabotage hadn't worked. The weather hadn't worked. The town of Oakhaven was about to learn that the girl they had laughed out of the diner wasn't just playing in the dirt, she was building an empire. And Sullivan, staring at his washed-out barren fields, realized he had made a very dangerous enemy. The mud from the 100-year flood had barely dried into a cracked crust before Ryan Sullivan changed his tactics. The weather had failed to ruin Abigail Hayes, and physical sabotage had only forced her to build a superior, drought-proof ecosystem. If he couldn't break her land, Sullivan decided he would break her supply chain. As autumn crept into Oakhaven, painting the surrounding forests in shades of burnt orange and gold, Abigail's farm was preparing for its most critical moment, the saffron harvest. The crocus sativus bulbs she had planted in the massive hugelculture beds had thrived. Nearly 3 acres were suddenly blanketed in a sea of vibrant, delicate purple flowers. But saffron is arguably the most unforgiving crop on earth. The flowers bloom over a chaotic 2-week window, and the 3 tiny crimson stigmas inside each flower, the actual spice, must be harvested by hand, entirely before sunrise. If the morning sun hits the exposed stigmas, the essential oils evaporate, ruining the flavor profile and rendering the crop worthless. It requires a massive, immediate labor force. Abigail had planned for this. Weeks in advance, she had placed advertisements in the local county paper and on community bulletin boards, offering $25 an hour, more than double the local agricultural wage for early morning pickers. The night before the first major bloom, Abigail's phone rang. It was Gideon Rowe, the mechanic who had helped her build her water system. "Abigail, you better get down to the community center," Gideon growled over the line, the sound of a sputtering engine in the background. "Sullivan's foremen are standing by your flyers. They're telling the local high school kids and the seasonal hands that anyone who steps foot on your property will be permanently blacklisted from working the corn and soybean harvests. He's threatening their families' livelihoods." Abigail's stomach dropped. She drove her rusted Ford Ranger into town, her headlights cutting through the autumn fog. Sure enough, outside the community hall, Brody, Sullivan's most loyal enforcer, was leaning against his truck, tearing one of her flyers in half. When dawn broke the next morning, illuminating millions of purple blossoms begging to be picked, Abigail stood at the edge of her field. She was completely alone. Tears of absolute frustration threatened to spill over, but she fiercely wiped them away. She grabbed a basket and dropped to her knees in the damp dirt. She had roughly 3 hours before the sun crested the tree line. She began snapping the flowers, her fingers flying with frantic, desperate precision. It was an impossible task. 3 acres of flowers equated to roughly 500,000 individual blooms. To harvest them alone was a physical impossibility. She was an hour in, her back screaming in agony, when she heard the crunch of tires on her gravel driveway. She stood up, expecting to see Brody coming to gloat. Instead, a convoy of beaten-up pickup trucks and rusted sedans pulled through the gates. Leading the pack was Gideon. Behind him poured out the outcasts of Oakhaven, the independent mechanics, the retired grandmothers who remembered when farming was about food and not chemicals, the bank tellers who were tired of Sullivan's arrogance, and a dozen teenagers who had decided that $25 an hour in cash was worth risking Sullivan's wrath. "We brought coffee," Gideon said, tossing her a thermos. "And we brought headlamps. Point us to the purple weeds, boss." Over the next 2 weeks, the Oakhaven Misfits executed a flawless clandestine operation. They arrived at 3 in the morning, working in the freezing fog by the light of headlamps, carefully harvesting millions of flowers and retreating to Abigail's refurbished barn to painstakingly pluck the crimson threads. But Sullivan wasn't done. When the harvest was complete, yielding an astonishing 15 pounds of premium grade A saffron, Abigail loaded a sample into her truck and drove to the regional agricultural distribution hub. This was the co-op that purchased every crop in a 3-county radius to sell to national markets. When she walked into the manager's office, Arthur Penhaligon, a man who played poker with Sullivan every Thursday, wouldn't even look her in the eye. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes," Arthur muttered, shuffling papers on his desk. "We can't accept your product. We have concerns about your organic certification and your proximity to unregulated livestock." "My soil tests are pristine, Arthur," Abigail said, slamming a thick folder of state-certified laboratory results onto his desk. "My water is cleaner than the town reservoir. You know this is Sullivan pulling the strings." "The board's decision is final," Arthur insisted, sweating profusely. "We won't buy your saffron, and we won't buy your mushrooms. You have no buyer in this county." Abigail walked out into the crisp afternoon air, the heavy scent of processing facilities surrounding her. Sullivan had successfully walled her in. She had the most valuable harvest in the state, sitting in her barn, and absolutely no way to legally sell it through traditional channels. That evening, Sullivan held court at Betty's Diner, buying a round of beers for his crew. "She's got a barn full of rotting fungus and dried flowers," he laughed loudly, making sure the entire restaurant heard. "I give her a week before she defaults on her operational taxes, and the bank auctions the whole lot." Back at the farm, Abigail sat at her kitchen table, staring at a small glass jar containing an ounce of blood-red saffron. She didn't cry this time. She opened her laptop. If Oakhaven didn't want her product, she would simply transcend Oakhaven. She spent the entire night bypassing the agricultural supply chain entirely. Drawing on her connections from the Pacific Northwest, she drafted cold emails to the executive chefs of the top 50 Michelin-starred restaurants in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. She didn't sell them a crop. She sold them a story. She detailed her regenerative soil practices, the pristine water catchment, and offered to overnight ship a free half-ounce sample to any chef who replied. 3 days later, a sleek, black Mercedes Sprinter van with Illinois license plates rolled past the rusty tractors of Oakhaven and turned down Abigail's dirt driveway. Out stepped Chef Laurent Davies, a notoriously brutal culinary perfectionist whose Chicago restaurant had a 6-month waiting list. He had received her sample. He walked straight into her barn, inspecting the curing racks of lion's mane mushrooms and holding a pinch of her saffron up to the light. He crushed it between his fingers, inhaling the deep, complex aroma of honey and metallic earth. He turned to Abigail, ignoring the mud on her boots. "The saffron I import from Spain has half this flavor profile," Laurent said, his French accent cutting through the dusty air. "And these mushrooms? The density is spectacular. The stress of your minimal irrigation technique has concentrated the cellular structure." "What are you offering, chef?" Abigail asked evenly. "I don't want a pound," Laurent replied. "I want exclusivity. I will buy your entire harvest. The saffron at $4,000 a pound and the specialty mushrooms at $30 a pound. And I will pay the logistics to have a refrigerated truck here every Tuesday." Abigail extended her hand. Deal. Exactly 1 year to the day after Abigail Hayes had purchased the abandoned O'Connor property, the Oakhaven County Agricultural Board held its annual financial summit. It was usually an event designed to stroke Ryan Sullivan's ego. Held in the high school gymnasium, it was where the mega farmers showcased their yields and where the bank manager, Thomas Gable, publicly praised the men who kept the town's economy afloat. But this year, the atmosphere in the gymnasium was suffocatingly grim. The 100-year flood had devastated the conventional farms. Sullivan's aggressive tilling had resulted in massive topsoil loss, requiring him to take out predatory high-interest emergency loans just to buy enough synthetic fertilizer to make his land arable again. His corn yield had plummeted by 40%. Sullivan stood at the podium, looking haggard. His custom-tailored denim looked slightly too large for him. "It's been a tough year, folks," he addressed the crowd of anxious farmers. Acts of God. Supply chain issues. We need the bank to extend the forbearance period on our operational loans. We need community subsidies to repair the drainage ditches. From the back of the gymnasium, a voice rang out, clear and sharp. "Or perhaps you just need to learn how to farm, Ryan." The entire room turned. Abigail Hayes was walking down the center aisle. She wasn't wearing mud-stained overalls today. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer and held a thick, leather-bound financial ledger. Gideon Rowe walked a few paces behind her, a grim, satisfied smirk on his face. "Miss Hayes, this is a meeting for commercial agricultural producers," Thomas Gable stammered from the panelists' table, adjusting his glasses nervously. "I am a commercial agricultural producer, Thomas," Abigail said, stepping up to the microphone beside Sullivan, who looked as though he might physically explode. "In fact, according to the county tax records I pulled this morning, I am currently the most profitable farmer per acre in this entire zip code." Murmurs rippled through the bleachers. Brody sneered from the front row. "You're growing weeds and fungus on 40 acres of rocks." 35 acres of rocks, actually, Abigail corrected smoothly. "I only put 5 acres into active cultivation this year. The rest is still being restored by my livestock." She opened her ledger and projected her financial summary onto the screen behind the podium. The room went dead silent. On 5 acres of land, utilizing 0 synthetic fertilizers, 0 chemical pesticides, and 0 deep-tilling machinery, Abigail had generated a gross revenue of over $180,000. Her overhead costs, because she relied on biological systems rather than heavy machinery and diesel fuel, were a fraction of the county average. She had 0 debt. While Mr. Sullivan was washing his topsoil into the county river and borrowing against his grandchildren's future to buy liquid ammonia, Abigail announced to the stunned crowd, "My soil was capturing the rainfall. I built an ecosystem that regulates itself. I bypassed the local monopoly that tried to starve me out, and I secured direct-to-consumer contracts with the top culinary institutions in the country." She turned directly to Sullivan, her eyes locking onto his. "You told me you were going to starve me out in 3 weeks. You told me my land was a toxic wasteland." Sullivan's face was a violent shade of purple, but he couldn't form words. The numbers glowing on the screen behind him were indisputable. His own ledger was bleeding red. Hers was aggressively black. "But I didn't come here just to share my numbers," Abigail continued, turning her attention back to the bank manager. "Thomas, I understand that the 50-acre parcel of land bordering my eastern fence line, the lower field belonging to Sullivan Farms, went into foreclosure yesterday after Mr. Sullivan missed his 3rd consecutive loan payment." Thomas Gable swallowed hard, glancing terrified at Sullivan, but he gave a small, defeated nod. "That is public record, yes." Abigail reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. She walked over and placed it directly in front of the bank manager. "That is a cashier's check for the full assessed value of the property," Abigail said, her voice echoing perfectly through the silent gymnasium. "I'm buying it. I need more room for my pigs." The gymnasium erupted. Men were shouting, leaning over the bleachers to look at the check. Gideon threw his head back and let out a booming laugh that rattled the basketball hoops. Sullivan gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white, utterly humiliated, his empire beginning to crumble under the weight of his own hubris. Abigail didn't stay for the ensuing chaos. She turned her back on the stage, walked calmly back up the center aisle, and pushed open the double doors into the bright winter sunlight. The town of Oakhaven changed that day. The laughter that had followed Abigail for a year evaporated entirely. By the following spring, you couldn't drive down the county highway without seeing changes. Tractors sat idle as farmers began tentatively planting cover crops. The local hardware store suddenly kept a massive stock of mushroom spores and portable electric fencing. And every morning, Before the sun came up, a line of rusted pickup trucks could be seen parked along the edge of Abigail's property. They weren't there to mock her anymore. They were waiting at the gate, notebooks in hand, hoping the girl who tamed the Bramble estate had a few minutes to teach them how to save their farms. Abigail's journey proves that working with nature, rather than against it, is the ultimate recipe for success. Have you ever turned a patch of weeds into something beautiful? Let us know in the comments. If you love this story of resilience and sweet revenge, hit that like button, share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life farming transformations.